This is Stygian Sagas, dark fiction read by the author. Tonight, the Quirk Road. When I was asked to drive up the Quirk Road last October to check on the little village in the hills, I didn't think much of it. I was more inconvenienced than worried, irritated that I'd have to spend the better part of an hour rumbling up gravel and dirt tracks around hairpin turns, only to wear my brakes out coming back down the knobs. Roy was worried, though, so I agreed, if only so I didn't have to hear him moan and gripe. Quirk wasn't much more than a slipshod, leaning cluster of ivy-eaten houses in the woods, but it didn't aspire to be much of anything else. It had crept up long before my time, established by a weird religious strain sometime in the early 60s which few people recalled much about. There were no phones, no cars, and no power lines, and the residents kept soundly to themselves as their members aged or departed, and the population dwindled. There were only 5 people living up there now, Roy's younger sister and niece among them, and not one of them had been seen in almost 2 weeks. Generally, their battered old buggy would come rolling out of the trees behind a haggard old horse each Saturday. Lot, the scraggly old hermit that had founded the hamlet, would roll the 20 or so miles into the small town of Clarksville, buy what Quirk needed with money no one could ever quite guess the origins of, and then rattle back into the hills from whence he came. With no Lot in sight, and Roy worried his aging car couldn't make the climb, I was dispatched to make sure the lonely horse hadn't died and left the hamlet cut off. The road itself was overhung and dense, the kind of worn track where branches battered the windows and scraped the roof. Even in the comparative low country of central Kentucky, the forests can seem as if they were woven by hand, and they only become more impenetrable as rough terrain chokes the trees into tight vales and glens. The hills weren't as grandiose as some rocky Appalachian crag, but they were treacherous, muddy and prone to steep, sweeping inclines. My truck was bucked by deep potholes and dips in the old road, the undercarriage creaking and groaning in protest against the strain. I'd known what I was in for, but I was never quite ready for the brutality of the ride. Roy had made me drive up several times over the years to deliver groceries or gifts, especially prior to winter, when the snowfall threatened to swallow up the road. I wondered at how cautious the aged, bent Lot must be to navigate this tangle in a buggy. It was more than bumps and jolts that perturbed me, though, for the woods around Quirk always had a strange feeling about them that was hard to put into words. The crisp autumn air outside was silent beyond the cacophony of the truck, with the bird song and bug chatter having died away soon after I turned off the paved roads. My open windows were usually a comfort this time of year, when the forests were beginning to wind down for the chill. But in these hills it seemed as if the wind didn't dare stir the leaves. The dense undergrowth on the roadside produced no spooked deer as I trundled past, an oddity at this time of year. I was able to dismiss most of those worries as my own overreactions. After all, for a patch of unmolested forest to fall silent at the sound of a strange vehicle seemed natural. These hills were isolated, and my engine was probably the only one that had braved the road in months. Moreover, the whole region viewed the residents of Quirk with more than a little suspicion. They lived in a way that seemed similar to the Amish from without, but the Amish and Mennonite sects in the region vehemently denied any relation to them. Their small group seemed to have more to do with New Age spiritualism born of the 60s, but no one ever grew close enough to know what exactly that entailed. The group wasn't conversational, and they never took well to prying eyes and ears. Rumors swirled through the surrounding counties now and again, discussing the background of one of the residents or the odd, sourceless money Lot seemed prone to produce. Old-timers like Roy would visit a relative and check up on things, but the people of the hamlet were always reticent, far keener on conversation about weather than what went on behind Quirk's dilapidated doors. With so much talk surrounding the weird little settlement, it was no wonder to me that the area boasted its own icy atmosphere. What happened in Quirk, and what must have been happening in Quirk for quite some time, has made me reconsider that, however. Perhaps the stillness was spurred by something larger, as if the forest itself was waiting for things in the twisted little hamlet to turn south. Whatever the case may be, my nerves didn't hold out through the drive. The first sign there was something amiss in Quirk was a dark stain across the center of the road. I was about 30 minutes into the slow, pondering drive when I saw it, barely visible in the afternoon shade. The gravel was tossed around, and the brush gave way like something had barreled off the road through the scrub, or been dragged off it. I actually stopped the truck and considered getting out, but I thought better of it. The forest seemed even more hushed than usual in those few seconds, poised as if frozen in place as the truck rumbled its continuous drone through the trees. I scanned the woods past the road, but the shade was so impenetrable that I couldn't make anything out, past the varied hues of turning leaves. There was something unplaceable about the scene which made me uneasy, a timidness I couldn't quite place until I rounded the next bend in the path. This time, there was no vagueness to the stains and the struggle. The dirt had been kicked and gouged all down the lane, and the same dark stains marred the earth right up to the base of a gnarled birch that flanked the road. It was long dead, a white-barked skeleton amidst the autumnal foliage, and up its trunk ran those same crimson streaks in dirty, haphazard smears. Then, so high up I had to crane my neck out the window to see, I found what had left the stains. Twisted like a broken toy, the worn old horse that pulled Lot's buggy had been hoisted up and displayed from a birch branch. Its stomach was torn wide, its hooves fixed to the branches. It took me a moment to notice that the ropes that bound it in its spread-eagle position were entrails, probably the horse's own. The head dropped low, almost comical if divorced from the grim spectacle of the scene, its fly-gnawed black eyes fixed upon the road. There was a sort of script scrawled on the pale bark of the dead birch, I noticed. It was strange, unfamiliar to me, more pictographic than alphabetical. I wondered for the briefest of moments whether the markings were accidental, but then I noticed the bloody handprints that littered the tree, as if a large man had clambered up to hoist his trophy after the slaughter. I'm not ashamed to say I might not have finished the drive uphill if I'd had a solid way to turn around on Quirk Road. As it was, I was almost to the top, and after a moment spent catching my breath, I pressed on around the final bend in the road. I could turn around in Quirk's gravel courtyard, I told myself. I'd figure out what happened if I could, but I'd have the truck ready if I needed to speed back down the mountain, brakes squealing all the way. If only it had been that straightforward. There were 4 houses around the little gravel court, wreathed and bent, all several decades past their prime. Shingles sat askew, porches sagged on sinking supports, and siding peeled off to hang unattended in the damp woodland. The smell of decaying planks and rusted nails hung about the place, as it always did. But there was something else, something strange even by the standards of Quirk. The door to the leftmost home, which generally stood empty save for stored piles of decaying furniture, had been left swinging wide on its hinges. Taking another scan of the houses, I realized they were all amiss, with time-stained windows standing open or fresh holes knocked through the aging walls. The whole clearing seemed suddenly darker, carrying an air of menace that even the butchered horse couldn't match. Though I wanted nothing to do with the moldering little hamlet, I forced myself to open up the truck's door, meaning to call out a couple times to see if I could get anyone's attention. My voice, shaky through the shade-strangled afternoon despite my best efforts to sound imposing, got no response. It was only as I went to duck back into the truck that I noticed a flickering light, faint but definite, catching the dirty pane of Lot's open window. My first thought was that a fire had started in the house. I decided more than a little reluctantly to make sure I wasn't leaving some wildfire waiting to happen behind me, calling out again as I covered the distance between my truck and the central home. The porch creaking under my weight, I leaned over and looked through the window. What I saw within wasn't violent or shocking, but it did nothing to alleviate the shroud of threat that lurked over Quirk. Lot's teetering old house was filled with equally teetering bookshelves, at least on its lower story. Plain-backed volumes aged by use as much as time spilled off into piles upon the unkempt wooden floors. Amidst the maze of open books and weaving shelving, there was a sort of dark iron candelabra standing on an uneven table. Yellowed candles shimmered in the low light, burned so low they were more misshapen stumps than cylinders. They had clearly burned for some time, and the wax had pooled here and there around the candelabra base, giving the impression the room had sat vacant for days. I knocked on the door, but it swung inward with the slight force of the blow. Making sure to sound off every few steps into the house, I quickly swung through the haphazard foyer into the little library and snuffed out the candles. With one last, nervous call to the unseen residents of Quirk going unanswered, I made for the truck which still idled in the courtyard, satisfied at least that I wasn't leaving behind a nascent bonfire. Someone else could go snooping through the houses. I just pulled open the truck's door when motion teased the edge of my vision. I snapped my head toward the little path that ran further uphill, and for a moment I could make nothing out past the multicolored veil of drooping fall leaves and branches. Seconds later, I could swear I saw a silhouette run off along the trail, little more than a bobbing shadow amidst the trees. Another moment passed as I strained to see more, and a sort of pained scream ripped through the woods, distant but almost certainly from above, at the crest of the ridge upon which Quirk stood. It sounded youthful and feminine, agonized beyond anything I'd ever experienced. I imagined it was Roy's niece, a young adult but by far the youngest member of the strange group around Quirk. I listened for another second or two, the last echoes of the vocalization dying away into the stifling air of the silent woodland. My eyes darted from the little uphill path to the downhill road out of Quirk, my psyche racked as it tried to think up some moral excuse to flee down the mountains. I slid into the truck, but I managed to force my hand into the glove compartment, finding the little .38 I kept beneath some notebooks and a pressure gauge. I flicked off the idling engine, pocketing the keys, my eyes constantly on the hilltop from where the sound had come. I couldn't see it as anything more than a rise in the trees, a bulge in the autumnal canopy denoting the steep slope of the knobs above Quirk. Taking several halting steps towards the rise, I faltered. My phone was produced, but the motion was wasted. Signal was non-existent this far up the ridge, as it always was. Still, I kept it in hand as I forced myself to proceed, praying on some subliminal level that I might be able to use it on the highest reaches of the knobs. If someone was in trouble up there, it'd take help a long time to get to them. I mentally appended that them to an us as I walked into the trees. Each pace was a close-fought victory in the internal debate on whether this was a stupid idea. I was certain it was, but the issue was complicated by whether I could justifiably turn tail and run. Looking back and knowing what I know, it's easy to reassess those thoughts and scold my past self for risking the walk up that hill. At the time, though, I thought it was the right thing to do. The only right thing to do. The worn dirt footpath wasn't long, but it was trying. The steep incline and knotted roots winding across the way made me keep my eyes to the ground, and the press of the leaves was dense. Every step made me feel suffocated, surrounded on all sides. Any fretful glance through the trees revealed nothing but normal, rolling woodland, almost peaceful. Only the damnable quiet was there to remind me how wrong the place felt. When my head rose above the crest of the hill, I found myself looking at an aged, nearly toppled barn. It leaned, half-eaten by weeds and ivy, its dark paint sloughing off in great reams near its sides. The pallid, graying wood beneath was termite-ridden, and the roof had partially caved in, leaving a fair portion of the interior a mess of twisted, rusting sheet metal. It wasn't the gaping barn that made me stop dead in my tracks and clench tight the little .38, though. The doors had been standing open, letting the waist-high grass creep into the shadowy interior. In the mouth of the long-abandoned structure there stood something it took my mind a long while to process. At first I took it to be an animal, but with an icy drip to my gut I realized it was a sort of sculpture. The grotesque silhouette of the thing was hellish enough, but it was the medium of that sculpture which made it unbearable. The 5 corpses of each resident in Quirk had been stripped naked and arranged with the aid of sharpened, corroded rebar rods in the dirt at the mouth of the barn. 4, 2 men and 2 women, had been split from groin to sternum, their lower limbs broken and twisted into 4 singular, slender legs. Their feet, bent at impossible angles, arched forward in mockery of hooves, while their upper bodies arched inward with their arms intertwined, a sort of sick quadrupedal torso. It was, unmistakably, the warped body of a buck, and along the spine of the fleshy construct, Lot himself had been affixed by the legs. His chest and shoulders bent sharply up, his arms split in 2 past the elbow and bound into elegant, fingered antlers with twine. His head was nowhere to be seen. Rather than a skull, the makeshift deer boasted a great, gaping wound where its head should be. Lot's torso had been hollowed out, and it yawned open and torn between his upraised arms like a rancid womb. Making the whole panoply all the fouler was the stench. The silence was broken at last, a droning chorus of flies gnawing their way through the corpse art, careless of the horrid ambiance they'd offset. All 5 had been dead and gone for days, left to spoil in the open air, miraculously untouched by larger scavengers. Even through the shock of the moment, I had one maddening, salient thought, one that refused to be overshadowed, pushing its way to the front of my consciousness. Who had screamed? I couldn't have stood there for long, but I remember every detail. I don't believe I'll ever be graced enough forgetfulness to scourge that image from my memory, much as I wish it were possible. I might have gone right on standing there, stock still and staring, petrified, if a noise hadn't rung out beyond the sculpture in the barn. It was a hollow, echoing sound, made booming by the empty half-ceiling of the ruined building. Still, it was loud, with a heft that made me sure there was real weight behind the noise. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, but somehow eerily familiar. If a giant buck had bedded down in the depths of that tottering barn and snorted the kind of wheezing, jolting snort a buck gives when warning other deer away, it would have been quite similar. But this noise was too weighty, too impossibly deep. I'd have a hard time visualizing a bull moose making so bassy a sound. The noise snapped me to my senses. If it was a large animal, it might have been a bad idea to run, but I'd resisted running since riding into Quirk. I wasn't about to stop myself again. The run was breathless and thoughtless. I focused on nothing but the occasional glint of the truck through the trees, and was conscious of every fallen boot as I descended the slope. Covering the last yards between the woodline and the vehicle, I heard, or thought I heard, the snapping of limbs and branches like bones on the hill. Again, that not-quite-deer call sounded, and I slammed the door and started the truck, hanging low over the wheel as if to hide from the awful noise. What happened afterwards puzzles me to no end. The vague, dreamlike qualities of it have me convinced it must have been panicked fantasy. Perhaps the noises, too, were panicked fantasy, imagined after so awful a shock, conjured up by a mind that thought it was in mortal danger. Whatever the case may be, my memory of the Quirk Road I drove down on the way out was nothing like the Quirk Road I climbed coming in. The Quirk Road of before might have been ominous, but the Quirk Road of afterward was a waking nightmare. The lane ahead was almost dark, swallowed up by a canopy of heavy, waterlogged leaves. The trees that bore them were unwholesome and swollen, distended along the trunks, their bark bulging outward in awful curves, sap spilling from wounds where the wood had split under the strain. Their height was abnormal, and as I craned my head to look around the surreal forest, I realized the trees towered overhead, many hundreds of feet high, far beyond anything which should be possible for the average oak, birch, or straggling conifer in the hills. Desperate to get my bearings, I initially thought I'd taken a wrong turn. I told myself that in my haste I'd started down a different road than before, some access road or forgotten trail. But then, rounding the first sharp bend, the familiar dead birch, twisted and bent even more radically than before, loomed out of the interwoven flora. The dead horse still hung, and the bloody swathe leading upward still shone against the pale bark. The day's dead animal kicked and twisted now, spasming and lashing against the branches with sluggish life, each thrash sending a mist of half-coagulated, stinking blood down to patter upon the windshield below. I accelerated as much as I dared, but the road seemed more treacherous now than ever. If there was one horror beyond horrors, it was the idea of careening off into the nightmarish trees and having to take the rest of the Quirk Road on foot. Attempting to keep focused on the goal, I forced my eyes forward and maintained the pace, each minute dragging on as the truck jolted and jerked. The woods outside were alive with song this time, but it was not the song of the hills as they are beyond Quirk. The birds and insects were still gone, replaced with a droning drumming which, though far away through the trees, shook the windows of the vehicle. Its beat was rhythmic and repetitive, and no matter how far I moved along Quirk Road, it never grew nearer or fainter. Every minute or two, another of those braying, wheezing snorts ripped through the trees, often just to the side of the path. Flickers of motion drew my eyes, but I always found shadows at the source, flitting from trunk to trunk along the woodline as I rolled past. So it went for a considerable time. I can't say how long this hallucination went on, as it left me in the same meandering, dream-like fashion it had gripped me. Fading like a fit of sleep, I jolted as if awakened just as I was about to roll into a four-way intersection in Clarksville, several miles away from the start of Quirk Road. With no memory of how I'd gotten from the overgrown road into town, I went first to Roy and then to the police. They turned over the little hamlet for days, picking over every scrap of paper and unopened drawer. The effigy was there in the barn, just as I'd described, as was the hanging horse in the tree. I was no idiot, and I never let slip what I thought I'd experienced after finding the corpses on the hill. Though the suspicion directed my way was transient and brief, I imagine I'd have been grilled much more thoroughly if I'd told Roy, or anyone else, about the experience of returning down Quirk Road. The investigation up in the ruins of Quirk overturned many strange books, some penned by Lot himself. The one most readily offered up as explanation for the slaughter was something written in a dead language, Phoenician if I remember correctly. Since last year, a consensus has developed that the little group conducted some kind of ritual suicide, fulfilling a long-held plan of offering that no one outside the commune had any insights on. The one remaining problem was the construction of the deer effigy, which authorities assumed must have been carried out by some sixth party, unknown to outsiders. As they turned over stones looking for related groups across the country in the ensuing year, talk never quite died away in the surrounding towns. So gruesome an event left an indelible mark, and it would likely be years until the scars of it faded from the region's collective memory. Roy is the exception to the rule. I imagine he's trying to forget in his old age, lay aside the memory of the family he'd lost to long isolation and occultic madness. That's what I assumed until last week, at least, when he phoned me up out of the blue, wanting to talk about a strange dream he kept having. The dreams, beginning right around the start of October, involved Quirk. He was walking down the road out of the hamlet, freed of his limp and breathing trouble, as he might have done many years ago. Then, as he nears the end of the way, something steps out of the woods to block his path. Something which stirred up lurking memories of things seen in that last half hour on my imagined, twisted mirror of the Quirk Road. What he saw, in short, was something like a satyr. It was hooved, shaped vaguely like a man, but instead of being goat-headed, it was topped by the head of a massive buck, antlers splayed across the road. Its arms, long-fingered and scythe-like, were outstretched, and its yellowish eyes had been narrowed. He described the noise it made, and shivers convulsed me in the warmth of my living room while I listened to him over the phone. I saw the very same deer thing, looming large in my rearview mirror on the Quirk Road, last October. It was lost to my memory right up until he described it, along with the end of the drive out. Then, as if pulled from a murky pool, it bobbed to the surface at Roy's words, desperate for recognition. Right before I turned off the road, I remembered, snorting its wheezing, angry snort from the shade, as if warning me not to return. I haven't told him yet about the noise and the thing I saw in the roadway. I don't know what his dreams mean, if anything at all. Still, it's hard to drive the woodland roads at night, or pass by the blocked-off terminus of the old Quirk Road by daylight. Harder still is deciding how seriously to take my memory, unreliable as things like memory tend to be. I know one thing, though. I'll never be caught dead in the forest around Quirk, day or night. Whatever puts a hush to the woods and makes the birds stay clear can keep it.